When I was in my late 20s, like most Christians, I had read much of the Bible, but I had never really read the Bible all the way through, starting in Genesis 1 and going all the way through Revelation 21. And so I did it. I read it all the way through, and it was a great experience. And I remember thinking, this is really interesting. This is really a great experience. And it puts together a whole lot of questions that I might have had in my mind. But I also remember thinking, most of this book is for someone else. Because much of what I read in the Bible seemed to be addressed to a different generation, a different time, a different culture, just a different people. Rather than being relevant to me, there were some passages, of course, that I could relate to that were speaking directly to me. You can't go through the Proverbs and not have that. But much of it seemed to be out of my context. And let me give you an example of that. Over in 1 Peter chapter 1, the very first verse, Peter is addressing his letter, and he says, "Those who reside as aliens, scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, and Asia and Bithynia." An alien? Someone who belongs somewhere else, another nation, another planet, but not here. Yet they're living here, they're residing here, and they're working here, and that's what that letter, who that is addressed to. And that wasn't really me. But much of it seemed to be in a different context. It must be written to someone else. Later in the same chapter, Peter writes, "But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear their intimidation. Do not be troubled." Well, as a 26-year-old, living not too far from the beach in Southern California, I had never suffered for righteousness. I had never been intimidated for my faith, and maybe I got a little sunburned, but Peter definitely was writing to someone else. Now, nearly 40 years later, I've read through the Bible several times, and I don't think it is written to some other people. I have come to realize that it was then, and it always will be relevant to all people at all times and all cultures. That's why in 2 Timothy 3:16 it says, "It is profitable for teaching and for reproof and correction." Well, the passage that we're looking at this morning is very much like 1 Peter. The situation is pretty much the same. In fact, the Christian church in the first century in general were all in very similar circumstances, and it was a difficult time to be a Christian in the first century, a very hostile culture to be existing in. So the Apostle Paul is writing to his beloved church that he began, that he planted in Philippi, the first Christian church in Europe, and he is concerned about his church. He wrote the Philippian letter from imprisonment, most likely in Rome, possibly in Ephesus. And it had been years since he had seen his church in Philippi, and he had been missing his brothers and sisters. They had an incredible relationship. They loved each other. But he had started to hear little bits and pieces and reports that not everything is going completely as he would hoped in the church. And they had been under attack in a few different ways. And let me just tell you some of the attacks that was happening to the church. First of all, there was an attempt to undermine Paul's ministry by other people in the ministry, and to try and discredit Paul. And that was a little bit concerning to Paul. There was some disunity starting to surface in the church. Internal strife between a few of its members, and we're going to see that when we get to chapter 4. There had been some opposition to the church, and there was evidence that the church had become very frightened over this opposition. Persecution. Persecution was a real threat. Don't really know if persecution had actually started to take place, but it was certainly around every corner. Abuse was a real threat. In fact, other places in the New Testament tell us that there was physical abuse to the Christians living at that time. This was a time of real outside hostility. Paul even says that there are enemies of the cross of Jesus Christ. And also Paul is just concerned that there might be some defection going on. Hey, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't real easy being a Christian. I thought my life might be getting better, might be getting easier. So there is the possibility that the people are just going to give up. It's just too hard to be a Christian in Philippi. And so it might be tempting to say, well, Philippians was written to someone else. Because I doubt that any of us in this room today have really experienced any persecution for our Christian faith. We haven't most likely been physically accosted for meeting together in this place. In fact, I think it's been pretty much life as usual for most of us. So I would like to spend just a few minutes here revealing why this is a most relevant passage to us this morning in our culture right now, in this church. So what I am going to share for, let's say, the next 10 minutes or so is not being shared to you to get you upset. It is not to get you depressed or angry. Because remember, Philippians is a book of joy, right? Amen. But seriously, what I'm going to tell you is basically, to put this, it's historical. It's how it is, and probably how it's going to be. And Paul's words will tell us then, in light of that reality, this is what we're to do about it all. Also, I'm not intentionally trying to be nostalgic. I'm not trying to say, and I don't want to be accused of saying, well, those are the good old days, and now we're in the miserable days. In fact, if you hear me out, you will not hear me say that. In my lifetime, and in many of yours, if you're over 45, probably more like 50, there has been a seismic shift in our culture. Unlike, I think, any other time in history. When you consider the contributions of technology and even the way that we travel today, transportation and education, no society, I think, has changed so much in such a short period of time, maybe the last 40, 50 years. Aristotle said something very, very profound. He says, if you want to know what it is like to be wet, don't ask a fish. Now think about that, because being wet is all a fish knows. And by the time the fish finds out anything different, it's way too late for the fish. So today we talk a lot about the culture. We really do. I read about it all of the time. I have a library full of books telling me about today's culture. And I talk about it just about every day. And we Christians who have been on earth for a while, we actually kind of lament about many of the things that have happened and have changed in this culture. 50 years ago, we didn't talk about the culture as Christians. You know why? We were the culture. We didn't know that there were big looming problems that were taking place because we were fish in the water. I grew up in a time where, for the most part, the culture around me was Christian. And if they weren't Christian, they would act like they were Christians. Or at least they played along with everyone else acting like Christians. It seemed as though everyone went to church. And it seemed, we thought everyone went to church. At least most people said they went to church. Everyone in my neighborhood And I grew up smack in the middle of Orange County, a mile from Disneyland. Everyone was either a Baptist, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, a Lutheran. Everybody claimed to be something. There were no stores of any kind open on Sundays. Remember that? Because that was the day you go to church. That was the Sabbath. And even though we got the day wrong, being Sunday, it was a day of rest. And I thought everybody did go to church as I was growing up. I remember when the grocery store down the street decided to open at noon on Sundays. Now that was a good time to open. Church would be letting out, and what's wrong with that? Well, it was an outrage. In fact, everybody boycotted it until they needed some milk or some butter on Sunday afternoon for the church meal. It was a safe world. Now, I'm not discounting a whole bunch of unrest that went on in the 60s and racial strife, protests over the war and so forth, and culture definitely was starting to erupt. But it was a safe world in our picture that we had in our minds. I was a Boy Scout, and my Boy Scout leaders were all great, manly Baptist men from the Baptist Church. I went to public school, and it was not a hostile environment. I wasn't an alien in that school. And what was being taught in that school was in no way in opposition to what was being taught in the church. Most of the teachers went to church. At least they said they did. And all that seems like such a short time ago. It's like we just woke up one morning and all of a sudden all of that was gone. In fact, it is so gone that you can almost hardly remember that it ever was. We were fish and water. We didn't know anything but water. Our cultural Christianity. We didn't see the problems. We didn't see any problems. We didn't see any problems coming. America is Christian. And that's what we thought. But it didn't change overnight. We're starting to realize now that what we thought wasn't really what we thought. I was reading an article by Al Mohler. Al Mohler is the president of Southern Seminary in our denomination, and he dug deep into this issue, and he concluded, he says, back in the 60s, cultural Christianity really had, for the most part, a false gospel. It was a false gospel of moralism. Cultural Christianity was basically about behaving. It was not so much about trusting Christ, but it was behave. Go to church. Be nice. Keep the lawn weed-free and short. Behave. That's not to say that there were not many very sincere Christians, but when we look at the big picture, it was a moral issue of being a Christian. In fact, I was reading President Eisenhower wasn't a religious man at all. And he officially joined the Presbyterian Church back in 1953. Why? Because he thought that piety would look good as being a president. He says it would look good for him to be a church goer. And that was behaving. But Jesus didn't say, go out into all the world and behave. He said, make disciples. It's interesting, many of the sociologists I've been reading, Peter Berger and Charles Taylor, incredible insight into what has gone on over the last 40, 50 years. They're now telling us that secularization happens when words begin to lose their meaning. And the most recent Pew survey says that 9 in 10 Americans say they believe in God. Now that's incredible. In fact, that's not a whole lot different from the 50s. But what has changed is the meaning of what God is. In fact, God has lost its meaning for most people. And everyone seems to have a different definition of what God is. Our culture seems to have changed. Listen to a few of these things. And again, it's not to make you angry. And it's not to get you all upset and ready to go and march. This is just a few years ago. In fact, 3 years ago is this particular one. InterVarsity Christian Fellowship Most of you know it as true today. They were kicked out of all of the California state universities 3 years ago. The Cal State University system is the largest college system in America, probably the world. And InterVarsity Christian Fellowship is one of the largest, most respected collegiate Christian organizations in the evangelical world. But they were kicked off of all of the campuses in California, and the official statement from the state was this: they were de-recognized as a valid student organization. I thought that was a great term, de-recognized. I've never heard that term. Anyone heard that term? It's kind of like you run into someone you haven't seen in 30 years, you can now say, I de-recognize you. But why were they de-recognized? Well, because they required their student leaders to be Christians. The leaders of InterVarsity, the Christian student organization, actually required their leaders to be Christians. That's amazing. So they're kicked off of the campuses as being discriminatory. And there was a time that you would put on your resume that I was a leader in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and that would help you get the job. But now you would be de-recognized for that position. By the way, since then, InterVarsity is back on the campus, and unfortunately they revised their policy that anyone can be in leadership. Fire chief in Atlanta, Georgia, you might remember this, about the same time, wrote a book on his own time. He wrote a book about his life. And this is outside of being a fire chief. And in the book, he revealed that he upheld biblical view of morality. And he had the audacity to actually articulate that in the book. And he was fired. He lost his job. It was a very public situation. One more, and I'm not going to mention bakers and florists, okay, I promise. But again in California, remember that how California goes, so goes the nation. So everything happens in California first. It's an interesting place. And this just a couple of years ago also, but California banned all of their state judges from being associated to the Boy Scouts in any way. The Boy Scouts of America. And many of the judges, they helped out in Boy Scouts. They were Boy Scout leaders. They would go out on the campouts with the Boy Scouts, and they were mentors to the young boys, but they were banned from having anything to do with them. And if they did, they would lose their bench. Why? Well, just 3 years ago, the Boy Scouts allowed their boys to be gay, but they did not allow their leaders to be gay. And that was discriminatory. Now, get this. This is what I want you to see. It's not so much that situation, but this is what I want you to see. The ruling that they came up with said that judges could not participate in any organization that discriminates in any way, except for one. You know what that would be? Church. They could still go for the time being to church, even if the church is discriminatory. But the question that I want you to think about is, how long will that be when the culture turns that corner? That if you're a member of a church, then you may not be able to hold your job, especially if you work for the government. You may not be able to get a home loan. You might not be able to get medical care. You may not be able to draw on Social Security. How long is it going to be when we find out in our culture that our culture considers us, in the words of Peter, as aliens, rightly exiled? And a bigger question is, when will we finally realize as Christians we are exiles and aliens? This was never meant to be our home. As long as we thought we were the culture, we didn't think about this. We didn't talk about this. We were fish in the water. When we thought that the culture was at least friendly to us and included us and actually looked mostly like us, we never worried about any of this. When we read 1 Peter, we thought, well, that's for someone else. when we read Philippians chapter 1. That's for someone else. But now we know it's really for us.
Yes.
Because this is really happening. So now, all that was to do is to show how we can relate to this passage. We can relate to what Paul is telling his church in Philippi. And for we are, in many ways, very much like that church. And what does Paul tell them to do? This is so important. He does not tell them, okay guys, let's form a militia. He doesn't say, let's build a bunker and let's bunker down and let's get ready for war. He doesn't say form a radical religious rite and reclaim the culture. He doesn't say that. Why? Because we're aliens.
Amen.
This was never meant to be our home. We just thought it was. We were always aliens, and we still are.
Yes.
And we will always be until we are finally taken to our heavenly home with Jesus Christ.
Yes.
So what does Paul say? He says, in light of all of this, this is what you're to do. Only conduct yourself worthy in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ.
Right.
So that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will not hear of you, that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God. For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake, not only to believe in him, but to also suffer for his sake, experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here to be in me. Those are amazing words. And verse 27 is really a transition of subjects. The first 26 verses, which we've already gone through and we've seen, Paul's focus was on himself. He was trying to encourage the Philippian church to not be concerned or to be worried over his circumstances and his imprisonment. Even though Paul was imprisoned and he was chained 24/7 to a Roman guard, he says the gospel is spreading. In fact, it spread through the very guards that were chained to him, as we saw last week. And then, even though his circumstances were not good, Paul had an incredible, deep, deep joy. Why? Because through his circumstances, he says, Christ is being proclaimed, and in this I rejoice.
Yes.
But he didn't just leave it there. Yes, I rejoice. Verse 18. But now what he does is he shifts from the attention on him and his circumstances, and he is looking right at the church at Philippi, knowing that they are going through some incredible difficulties, all those things that I listed earlier, similar to the things that the church in America today is going through or getting ready to go through. And what does he say to them? What does he say to us? What are his instructions? Well, in a nutshell, he says it doesn't really matter if I'm with you or I'm not with you. What matters is not what's being thrown at you. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are. It doesn't matter what the culture is heaving at you. What matters is the character of your conduct.
Amen.
Somebody said the Christian life is not a playground, it is a battleground. Because there is an enemy that's out there that is trying to snatch, to steal the treasure of the gospel of God's people. The enemy is not the judicial system of California. It isn't the Board of Regents at the state colleges. It isn't the Boy Scouts. It isn't the politicians or the political parties. Paul tells us who it is in the book right before Philippians. He says, our battle is not with flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of darkness. Against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places, Ephesians 6:12. See, we're in a battle with Satan. And the way we fight Satan is to be steadfast in our faith. So Paul gives us in this very short passage, these 3 verses, no less than 4 ways in which we are to do this. And we should be interested in this. The first one is to have consistency. Consistency. Verse 27, only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. You see, the most important and lethal weapon that we have against the enemy is not preaching sermons. It's not writing a powerful book. The most powerful weapon that we have against the enemy is a consistent life of a believer. We Christians have either furthered the gospel or we have damaged the gospel more with our lives than anything else. It is our lives that are seen by the watching world around us. The most effective action that we can take as Christians to the secular world around us is living holy lives. That's why he says only, above all, no matter what, above everything else, no matter the situation, no matter what's being thrown at you, it says only. It's an emphatic statement. And it stands for the essential issue, the bottom line issue for the Christian life and the Christian experience is only. Paul is saying, I want your life, I want your behavior as a Christian community existing as aliens in a pagan culture to be worthy of the gospel you proclaim. Your life matching the good news you are proclaiming. What does that look like? Well, if we jumped ahead to the next chapter, which I won't spend time there because we're going to get there, chapter 2, verse 15, he says, this is what it looks like. Prove yourself to be blameless and innocent. Children of God, above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, whom you appear as what? Lights of the world. Did you get that? When you're discriminated against for your alignment in Jesus Christ, if you lose your job because of your Christian testimony and your allegiance to Christ, he says only, above everything else, conduct yourself worthy of the gospel, blameless, innocent, above reproach, as lights, holding fast, he says, to the word of life. That's conduct worthy of the gospel, a life consistent to the good news of Jesus Christ. What's the good news? Everyone should know the good news. Jesus Christ, God, comes down in the flesh as man to pay the ultimate price for our sins, dies on the cross, paid that price, gets thrown in a tomb for 3 days. The great news is he did not stay there. He was resurrected on the 3rd day, and then he came back and was seen as proof. And because of that, we can spend eternity with him in heaven. That's the good news. We're to match our lives to that. I love Paul's choice of words. They're very, very rich. And as usual, it loses a little bit of the English. But that word that is translated as conduct, only conduct yourselves, is a real interesting verb in the Greek. Literally, it means to live your life as a citizen of a polis, a P-O-L-I-S. We get the word politics from that. We get the word political from that. Literally, a polis is a city. Metropolis. So conduct yourselves in a manner that would be proper for citizens in a polis, in a city. Behave the way that citizens should behave in where they live. But Paul is saying, but not as a citizen of earth, but as a citizen of heaven. Amen. Now that would have been a very meaningful word to the church in Philippi, because Philippi was a Roman colony. And because of that, If you were a citizen of Philippi, you would actually then be a Roman citizen. And with being a Roman citizen, that would have a ton of benefits that were attached to that. First of all, you'd be protected by Rome. The polis in the Roman culture was not just a place to live. It's much bigger than that. It was a philosophy of how to live, including a literal place to live. There was tremendous pride to be a part of a polis. People viewed the polis as more of a partnership. Everyone who was a citizen in a polis, they all set out to gain the highest good and the highest gain for society. There was very little just living for oneself. It was good for the city, whatever's good for the city. The good of the state and the mindset of that was the polis. So every individual was to develop his talents, was to develop his skills, was to go to work. And it wasn't just for his benefits, but for the sake of everybody who lived in a polis. It's an interdependency. It was a great privilege to be in a Roman polis unless you were a Christian. And that's where the church of Philippi is. So while we're on earth as aliens, we are to behave like heaven's citizens in heaven's city.
Yes.
Again, taking just a little sneak peek ahead in Philippians 3 verse 20, it says, "For our citizenship is in heaven." Now, I think it's tragic to see what's happening in our culture today in regards to the Christian faith. And I admit being a little nostalgic over the way things used to be, but this is not where my citizenship is.
Yes.
And instead of racking my brains out trying to figure out how I can fix society and fix culture instead of marching on Washington, D.C., I am to live as though I'm a citizen of heaven. Model Jesus Christ to a lost world. That's what we're told to do. I don't have to fix this culture. This isn't my final destination. I need to share Christ with this culture. And I best do that with the manner of living and the manner of lifestyle that I live. So we really should ask ourselves regularly the question, am I conducting myself in a manner worthy of the gospel? Just a couple other places that say the same thing in the Bible, so you know it's a major doctrine. In Ephesians 4, yes, Paul's words again. Verse 1, he says, "I implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling which you have been called." Now, how does that look? Well, it looks like this: with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love. Why should I do this? He says, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Over in Colossians 1:10, so that you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. Why? To please Him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God.
Yes.
I don't know, do you remember back in elementary school, one of the greatest moments in elementary school was when the teacher stepped out of the room? Remember that? We're left to ourselves. You know, when she's in the room, we're angels. When she leaves, we're devils. I kind of get that feeling that that's what Paul is. He's like the concerned teacher who's out of the room. And that's why he says, I want you all to behave, whether I'm in the room or outside of the room. But I think what he's getting at is he's telling this church at Philippi, I am not your physical, I am not your spiritual strength. So whether I'm with you or not with you is not an issue, because your strength isn't with me. Your faith isn't on me.
Yes.
So only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. Consistency. The second thing we're to do is to stand. Standing. The first part was all about walking the walk, and the second part is about standing firm. He says, only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, he says, I will hear that you are standing firm. Standing. That's a great term also. Standing firm is a military term. It means to to be at your post in battle. The picture is a soldier who is firmly planted, and he's not going to budge from his post no matter what is coming at him. I want to hear Paul is saying that you are standing at your post, and you're not going to move regardless of what's being thrown at you. When a soldier stands at his post, he's standing for two things. I don't know if you've ever thought of this or not. He's standing for his country, and he's standing against his enemy. We're standing for God, and we are against Satan. That's what we are to do. We're standing firm. So practically, what does that look like? It means don't move from God's Word.
Amen.
It means don't move from the lifestyle that is representative of the good news of Jesus Christ. Stay firm in that. It has something to do with purity. It has something to do with holiness. It has something to do with being obedient to Christ and having virtue. It's your spiritual character. Stand firm. Don't move from any of that. Don't move doctrinally. Stay firm on the doctrines of the Bible. Simply the teachings of what the Word says. All of it. And of course, one thing that drives me crazy is the American church today is lessening the standing on the doctrines of the Bible. So compromise means you're not standing firm. Compromise is being knocked off of balance. It's compromising it. Just a few pages back in the letter of Ephesians, again, Paul uses the same word there also. In chapter 4, verse 13, and he tells us how to stand firm. He says, take up the full armor of God. Do you remember what the armor is? I mean, a lot of pieces to that. Gird your loins with truth, breastplate of righteousness, shield of faith, helmet of salvation, sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Take up the full armor of God. That's how you're going to stand firm. Why? Not so that you can now go out and battle society. Not that you can now club the culture over the head. But it's so that you will, in his words, Paul's words, so that you will be able to resist the evil of the day and having done everything to stand firm. And how should we stand firm? Well, that takes us to the third thing, and that's unity. To be in unity. It's interesting because we go from the idea of a soldier standing firm, putting on the full armor, to that of an athlete. He says, only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear that you are standing firm. How? In one spirit. With one mind. Striving together for the faith of the gospel. Striving together. That's the Greek term, son athleo. Athleo. We get, of course, the word athlete from that. Son means with. Athleo means to compete in a contest. He's picturing the church as a team in an athletic contest. And he knows that when the team works together, there's a great chance of victory.
Yeah.
The first year that I ever went out for football in high school, freshman, you're the bottom of the heap, but there was this guy that was on our team. His name was Dave Walker, and he was a Neanderthal man. I mean, he really was. We barely had any hair on our legs, and he had to shave 3 times a day, I'm sure. We all looked at Dave as though he must be 30 years old. He probably already played professional football, and now he's back in high school. But he was so good. I hear he only lives about 60 miles from here. I got to check him out. But he was so strong. He was so far above the rest of us. And so Dave was our team. We had 60 guys out for football, and he was our team. Because everyone just figured, just hand the ball to Dave. And he could just go down and make touchdown after touchdown. And guess what? We lost about every game that year. Because there was no team. It was Dave. There was no unity. Nobody working together. Certainly no striving together. Give it to Dave. And that's exactly the picture here. It's that picture of athleta here that Paul's trying to get at. Playing as a team to advance the truth of God. You can't do it by yourself. You can't just hand it to someone. Go. To honor Christ and to do His will. There are no superstars in the church. The church is not an individual. It was never designed to be, but it's a body of believers that come together. Later in Philippians, we're going to see that there are two women in this church that are at odds with each other. And as a result, threatens to derail the whole church, to divide it. Because disunity weakens the church, it separates it, it ultimately destroys it. Are you starting to catch on just a little bit? This whole picture of being an alien in this culture? So different than what the culture would recommend for us to do, is it not? So alien to this world. Wait, you should fight back. But no, we're to fight back by living a godly life. You respond to a hostile culture by being a light. By continuing to stand on the principles that you've placed your life on, regardless of what the world throws at you and tries to knock you down. You're to stand firm on Jesus Christ, to become one-minded as a group of Christians. That's how we're going to be, because that's where we get our strength. Striving together. That's exactly what he's telling us. And if all that happens, there's an incredible confidence, which is number 4, confidence. He says, I will hear of you, that you're standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, semicolon. And then he says, in no way alarmed by your opponents. I really love these terms that Paul uses. You know, you have the soldier, you have the athlete, and now guess what it is? It's a horse. That word alarmed is a description of pretty much a worthless horse, but it's a horse in battle. And this is a horse that gets easily spooked. And because of that, no matter what happens, he gets spooked and he bolts. Most likely when he bolts and he runs for his life, it's when something very small, very harmless that caused him to be startled, and so he runs away. But the whole environment of battle, when you think about it, war, what that has done is it has intensified in his imagination and the fear in that horse. So with all of that noise going on and the battle going on and the intensity of war, all it would take is a little mouse to jump out from behind a log, and that horse throws his rider off and he gets out of town. And the picture here is when we have unity and we're standing firm and we all have the same mind and the same goals and the same spirit. We have the same ideology. We've gathered around and held fast to our doctrine and we embrace our arms together. In no way are we going to be like that horse and be alarmed. Either by the small little things that could pop out and spook us, or by the gigantic things that come at us and really could be of danger to us. In other words, there is nothing that the world can throw at us if we are unified and we are together that will derail us in all of these things that Paul is instructing us to do. There's nothing. That's standing steadfast. Standing firm, unwavering in your faith, living a righteous life, unified together with other believers. We can have a confidence that will lead to victory. The rest of that verse might seem puzzling. It says, in no way alarmed by your opponents. Then he says, which is a sign of destruction for them, but a salvation for you, and that too from God. You see, when hostility confronts you because of your Christian faith, what happens is your opponent is identified. And that's a good thing. And that opponent, he is saying, is headed for destruction. You know who your enemies are when opposition starts to take place. And not only that, but when you suffer for Jesus Christ, it says, that is a sign that you have your salvation.
Amen.
It's a sign that you're on the right side. Because the unsaved do not suffer for Christ.
That's right.
And that last word, suffering, what do we know? What are we as Christians to know about suffering? Expect it. Expect it. If you are a Christian who is walking in a manner worthy of the gospel, expect suffering. If we as a church are standing firm in our faith, together in unity, expect suffering. That's verse 29. For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake, not only to believe in him, but to also suffer for his sake. See, God has chosen you not only for salvation, but also for suffering. I mean, listen to that. He has granted you. That's the Greek word Eucharist, which means grace. They get the word Eucharist from that. That means he has graciously, get this, gifted you. Not only faith, but suffering. Suffering is a gift from God. Really? You didn't tell me that earlier. But it's true. He gave each one of us a gift of suffering. Somebody needs to tell Joel Osteen this. Suffering is a gracious gift from God. Why is it a gift? What is so good about suffering? Well, first of all, it assures you of your salvation. When they attack you, it tells you what side you're on. There's an assurance in that. It also reminds you where your hope is. Anytime you go through suffering, where does my hope go? It reminds you of that. Not here on this earth. It perfects you for usefulness. That's all over the Bible. That's the book of James. You get perfected in your suffering. And I think this one you can't miss, because this is one Paul hones in on. He says the fellowship of his sufferings. In other words, it provides union with Jesus Christ. We can join into his suffering on the cross. And it brings joy to us because it is a privilege to join him on the cross. Like the early church in Acts said, they counted it all joy to suffer. Why? For his sake. It leads to eternal reward. 1 Peter 4:13 says, but to the degree that you share the sufferings of Jesus Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation in your suffering. Suffering, expect it. Wow. Heavy stuff, isn't it? How are we to respond to the ever-changing American culture today? Only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come to see you or remain absent, I will hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is the sign of destruction for them, but a sign of salvation for you, and that too from God. For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake, experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me and now hear to be in me. That's our response. We're aliens. This is not our home. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, great words from Paul. Hard words from Paul. Maybe that's the Christianity not too many have wanted to sign up for. But it's true Christianity, and it's the Christianity that all is fastened around the incredible hope that we have in you. I'm so thankful that this is not my home. I am so thankful that the place where you want us to take up residency is with you in heaven. What an incredible place that is. I pray that every person in this room has embraced being exiled because they have chosen to walk in a manner worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I pray that even though the expectation is to suffer and the expectation is to eventually be even possibly persecuted, I pray that each one of us can see how the benefits of salvation is worth anything that the world can throw at us. I pray that each one of us embraces your Son, Jesus Christ, completely. We pray this for your glory in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Pastor. Would you all please stand and join us for one more song of closing?